Marking its 40th anniversary in 2022, Blue Door is the largest emergency housing provider in York Region, providing life-saving support to children, youth, adults, seniors, and families at risk or experiencing homelessness. Along with offering emergency housing and housing retention support, in the past 2 years, Blue Door has expanded its service offering to further work toward preventing and ending homelessness through Inclusion, the first supportive housing program for 2 SLGBTQ+ youth in York Region. Construct, a social enterprise by Blue Door, providing supported skills training to help youth and adults break barriers to employment and secure meaningful careers in construction trades. And launching in 2022, a health hub which will include a nurse and in-reach system navigator to help people regain the health and well-being needed to secure and retain permanent housing. Join Blue Door's mission and become part of the solution by learning more at bluedoor.ca.
We at On the Way Home would like to acknowledge the original stewards of whose lands this podcast is recorded on. In York Region, we recognize we're on the traditional territories of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe peoples, and that this is the treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit. And in Vancouver, we acknowledge that we are on the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, whose presence on these lands continue to this day.
Welcome to On the Way Home, a podcast dedicated to the issues surrounding homelessness and the incredible experts making a difference in the lives of homeless people. Remember to subscribe to the podcast anywhere you're listening and share it with a friend.
Welcome to another episode of On the Way Home. I am your host, Michael Braithwaite from Blue Door, and as always, we have a spectacular guest lined up for this week's show. Before I get rolling, though, I should tell you what's happening at the Canadian Alliance End Homelessness, our partner in this podcast, as well as what's happening at Blue Door. The Canadian Alliance, just a week ago, and by the time you hear this podcast, will be a few weeks, has announced its this year's conference, 2022, in Toronto. Don't you know? And now, they wanted to do this a couple of years ago. Of course, something called a pandemic got in the way. We've done a virtual conference. This conference is going to be a hybrid kind of mix, virtual, but also in person as well, which is really cool to have it in. Very convenient for myself and my team that it is just around the corner for us, a little south of Steeles will go down. So if you're interested in attending that, they do have an early bird rate, so check it out online. Also, if you want to be a presenter, if you have something to say, you've done some great work, some great research, there's a number of different topics that they're looking for presenters on. And of course, too, if you're a sponsor or if you want to get word out to people in this sector, this is the best place to sponsor. It is by far the largest conference in the sector across the country. So check that out at caeh.ca. And what's happening at Blue Door right now, lots going on. I am really, really excited that we are building we're not building, actually the region of York is building an 18-unit transitional housing site on one of our sites that we will operate, which is really cool. Listen, normally it takes about 24 to 36 months to put this up. The region is doing it in about a year and a half, which is incredible. It's a modular build. It was done through the support of the province and the federal government. So it's cool to see this happening in York Region where it is truly needed. 18 one-bedroom units. And York Region, our community, Blue Door, are thrilled for this to happen. But let's get to today's guest. Listen, it's not very often that we get to turn the tables on someone from the media and ask them some questions about, because usually they're doing the question asking, but it is fun when we do that. The experiences that members of the media, especially in this sector, have, the knowledge, working with government, working with others, or chatting with people in the sectors. It's incredible. I always enjoy these conversations. We have someone who I've known for quite a few years, run two different things. So I'm excited to have Jordan Press join us today. Now, Jordan is a reporter for the Ottawa Bureau of the Canadian Press, CP, national affairs reporter covering Parliament Hill and social affairs with a focus on data-driven storytelling and access to information. If it sounds like I ripped that off of a website, I did. I read that. So thrilled to have Jordan here. Jordan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. We always ask, we ask different questions throughout, but we always start with the same question for everyone because it's a little different for everyone who answers this. And Jordan, that question is, what does home mean to you?
So for me, it's not just a place. It's not just a structure, but it's a feeling. It is a place where you feel comfortable. It's a place where you are with the people that you not only consider, family, but maybe, people who are friends nearby. So it's almost part of community. And that to me has always been the feeling of home. I didn't, when I was growing up, we lived in the same houses for years on end. My parents didn't move around a whole lot. So I grew up in Toronto, for those who don't know me, and we grew up, in a small bungalow, and then we moved to a larger house when, my sister and I got a little older. And even, with my spouse and my family now, we don't move around a lot. We haven't moved around a lot in our time in Ottawa. And so for me, it is that feeling that when you walk into a place, that is the place where you feel comfortable. It is the place where you can be with your family and have laughter and love and health and happiness. And, maybe as my dog is right now sleeping on the bed next to me, and being, like I said, being part of that community where you walk out your door and it's friends, it's neighbors who are there, who are supporting you in different ways. And so, I know sometimes we just think of home as a structure, but it is much. I think it goes much beyond that to really encompass that feeling you have of being not just in a house, but being and not being housed, but being home.
So well said, and you're quite right. I think quite often when we ask that, no one talks about the structure, the roof, the walls. They talk about things you mentioned, that community feeling, the family feeling, a feeling of belonging, and that word feeling. And I think Adam Vaughn said, when we talk about, of course, this is around this podcast is based around housing and homelessness. He said, "Don't think of someone as a homeless person. Think of them as a neighbor without a home." And I thought that was well put by Adam. But before we get into it, I have lots of questions. Let's take a step back, learn a little bit more about you. How the heck did you get into this work?
So I mean, the easiest answer is my last name. It was either that or dry cleaning, and as you can tell, I'm not very good at that. But honestly, the way I kind of fell into journalism was I enjoyed storytelling. I enjoyed stories from a young age, and as I got into, and when I can remember being in grade 6 and having one of those writing challenges or writing assignments, and it was write a short story, and I think I tried to write like a mini novel because I just kept writing. And the same thing happened to me when I got to high school. I just enjoyed that writing. I enjoyed telling stories. And it wasn't really until later in my my time in high school, that I thought, what could I do where I could just write and tell stories from my life? And journalism seemed like a great opportunity, and it seemed like a fun thing to do. So that's exactly what I did. So I ended up applying to a couple of journalism schools, including to Ryerson University, the soon to be renamed Ryerson University in Toronto, and got into the journalism school and thought, all right, let's go. And that's kind of how I fell into journalism. And to be honest, after the first couple of weeks of school, I realized this was what I wanted to do. This really was my passion. My passion was words. It was talking with people. It was telling their stories. It was trying to not just talk about, as one of my editors later on in my career would say, not just writing about edifices and institutions, but writing about people and trying to understand them. And it might sound a little, kind of a little highbrow, but tell something about the human condition, right? These were all things that just started to evolve in me, and so when I left school, I was able to find some work. Landed a job at full time at the Kingston Whig Standard after doing summer internships at places like, my first summer internship was at the Nor'Wester in Springdale, Newfoundland, which is still, a town of 4,000 people. Like, it was great it was culture shock for a kid from Toronto. But, going from there to the Kingston Whig Standard and being there for a few years, going back to school, coming out of, going after doing a graduate diploma, and then working, going off to post media in Ottawa and working there, and then ending up at CP, which has just been like the National Wire Service. You hear stories your stories have such broad scope; they go everywhere, and so it's been this fantastic little ride that I've been on since I was really a kid, and it all comes back to this idea that every day I get to learn something new, and I get to tell a story in either this, maybe in a different way, and tell that to others. That's kind of how I fell into it, and that's what's kept me in it for probably now, if we count my time at university, like 20 something years basically.
Very cool. And it's interesting when you say that. Not at all were you thinking in high school, this is the way I'm going to make money. It was, this is what I'm good at. This is what I love doing. And I follow that. And when you do that, good things happen. And you talk about the stories, about the people. Let's talk a little bit, 20 plus years of telling stories. Let's talk about some of them that have really stayed with you. And I know every journalist says that this is a story that I often think back on that has really stuck with me, and why.
Yeah, and it's a good question, because when you write as many, they sometimes all blend together. But I think about one. One that comes to mind when I first started at CP, and I was just getting used to covering the housing and the homeless beat, the affordable housing and homeless beat, I should say. One of the things I did was I looked at the homelessness stats that the federal government had for, and I forget the exact name of it, but I remember the acronym HIFIS, right? Which is all the data they get from shelters, and they pull it all together. And so I was looking at, I filed an access request for that and got all these reports in different cities, and we ended up going to Thunder Bay because of some of the issues that were there at the time. And I think this was 2016 or so. So it was just after the Liberals had been elected in late 2015. And I spent a couple of days there. And I remember at one point, as I was reporting on this, I can't remember exactly how, but I was told, head up to this one agency kind of in this part of the city. And they said, oh, you know what, there's a rooming house nearby that I think you should take a look at. And there's some people that you can talk to about their housing situation. And it was an old church that had been with a basement that had been kind of subdivided into different rooms, and with a common space. And I remember walking in and speaking with the three residents who were there, and it was just, the conditions were deplorable. Myself and the photographer, and actually one of the women from the agency that came with us, the place was dirty. And when we went upstairs to the church area, it was overrun with birds, with pigeons, and there was pigeon droppings everywhere up there. The woman from the agency actually said, I didn't realize how bad this was. They come to us, we don't always go to them. And so the fact that she had to walk out for a moment just to compose herself said quite a bit to me. And as I was talking with these folks, just listening to them, say is this shouldn't be, this is what we can afford, but this shouldn't be our lives. And and so we wrote the story, and we had these photos, and we did video with them, and they were all very willing to talk. But I just walked out of there thinking that can't, how is that right? How is that right that someone lives like that? And the follow-up though to that story was that one of the key people involved, one of the men that we interviewed, who was Indigenous. He was actually, I think he was Mi'kmaq from out east. And I remember it was just before Christmas time. I think it was a year later, or a couple months later. The exact year escapes me right now, but I remember being on my way to a Christmas party with my spouse, and on the way my phone buzzed. And when we got out of the car, I took a look, and it was an email from someone saying, "Are you able to help me because he's died, and we're trying to connect with his home community." And I didn't have that many details about his home community because of the time we had, but it was just this, even though the story itself and what we wrote about the time really did stick with me, it was that follow-up that hit me as well. That here was a guy who, at the time had really, he had lost his partner, and he was really feeling down. He had a puppy that was keeping him company, I remember, in this rooming house. And then here he was, months later, and he dies. I think it was of an overdose, and it was just one of those things that stuck with me about a story is not something you tell once. A story, you may catch a sliver in time as a reporter, but these stories go on, and there are people who are affected by it before you have arrived and after you leave, and so I think that drove a lot of the thinking we had at the time about how do we cover this issue, and it continued to drive a lot of the thinking we had about how to cover this issue, even beyond after that I got that Christmas email that was a hard ending in some ways to that piece.
Yes, and unfortunately, far too often do you hear some of that. And I think you bring up a bit of what I think most Canadians. One of the reasons we do this podcast and we talk and do this, and one of the biggest challenges for us in this sector is that I think Canadians are kind, they're good in general, but most have no idea the type of crisis we're facing across Canada. In fact, right now, yes, housing, we've seen in the released budget across, housing is top of mind. But when people think of housing, they're saying, I can't afford to buy a house, the cost of rent, but not necessarily homelessness. But when they do learn, I find, or when they're hit with these stories, and the stories you tell, people are very generous. They want to respond. They just don't know, because often across this massive country of ours is very hidden. Where we are in York Region, York Region's 9 municipalities is huge. It's spread out. For the longest time, people just didn't think it was an issue because it wasn't like the streets of downtown where you see homelessness up front and close, right? But it actually does exist. So the stories you tell are hugely, hugely important. Now, let's talk about. I remember talking with you a few years back, just after I think. The change in government when the Liberals were there, and you kind of mentioned some differences to me. You said, when the Conservatives were in, this is kind of, how it changed for me when doing my job and when the Liberals are in. And so you've had time now with a few different parties on Parliament Hill and changing this. How does it change? How is it different? Can you expand a little bit on that?
Well, I think that what's happened over the past couple of years is there has been a bit of a move towards, at least from my perspective, maybe talking a little more about the policy as opposed to the politics behind it. There is always this tension, obviously, on Parliament Hill between the politicking, the partisanship, and the need to actually create policy, and then what is it that you are trying to do. But I think that over time, I've seen at least people, and this is from all parties, be more willing to engage on those policy points and trying to and getting off the partisan talking points and saying, what is it that makes a good policy right now? What is it that we know can actually work, and what is it that we know that doesn't work? I mean, when you think about, for instance, I know that the previous Conservative government doesn't get a lot of credit for some of the things that it does, and it rightfully gets a lot of criticisms for some of the things that it did. But I think they were they did housing first. They adopted that mentality and adopted that policy. It wasn't maybe well thought out, and it wasn't as robust as we see it now, but it was a stepping stone at the time. And so that, I think, gives you a sense of how things kind of develop, is that maybe one government starts something, another government then picks it up. The child benefit is another example. The previous Conservative government had the universal child care benefit. I mean, it went to everybody, and it maybe wasn't very well targeted, but then it started getting it began getting income tested, targeted on need, and there has been a measurable impact on poverty rates. The same thing could be you talk about the and I'm gonna use the old acronym for it, the working income tax benefit, right? There's another example of things that have helped the working poor that the previous Conservative government started and then got expanded by the Liberals a few years later. And actually, I remember writing about that coming out of one budget, and one of the people who had worked for former Prime Minister Stephen Harper on this, actually said to me on the phone, he's like, "I'm really happy they did this. This is great." He's like, "This is going to have a huge effect on people in particularly those low income and working poor." He said it's just going to be a really big he's like, it's just going to be a big pain in the butt to explain it to people because it's so complicated. But those are the things that I think I've seen happen, is there has been a willingness from parties to at least accept some other ideas, maybe a little more, even though there is the partisan sniping in public. And there has been an interest in trying to address some of those key concerns. Now, that said, I'm also aware that when these parties and when these governments come up with policies, they're thinking about votes. They are thinking about how, what is it that we need to get. It's why, as you rightly point out, why are they talking about housing right now and and home ownership as opposed to creating more rental, for instance, right? And talking more about that when we have a need for rental in this country. Those are the kind of, so what is it that's driving that? Well, I mean, we have millennials are the largest, generational cohort right now. They want to buy things. They tend to vote. So you can see parties trying to latch on to some of those concerns. And so I think so even though that is still there, I will say that there has been a much broader interest, I think, in having some policy discussions, at least from my perspective, which maybe when I started, there wasn't that interest. They were just partisan talking points. Now people seem to be a little more interested in let's have a conversation about what makes good policy for this country.
Fantastic. Now we're talking about government last week, and now by the time this podcast drops, it will be a few weeks out. There was a big budget drop. It was an exciting budget. I think for our sector, anyways, very exciting. Can you talk about what you saw as some of the biggest surprises in that budget, and then on the flip side, what have you heard, or what do you think are some of the biggest disappointments?
Well, I think that for starters, the thing that kind of surprised me was how much there was still there to try to accelerate some of the work that had already been done. So I think the Rapid Housing Initiative, I thought was a good surprise to see in there that there was more money going towards that. I mean, given how it has been oversubscribed, it has gone past its expectations as far as the units built, every round that it has done. And that is a good sign. I think that is also maybe gives a bit of a look ahead to what more this government may do on that front and what CMHC may be interested in doing as well, just given how easily in some ways it is able to get things done as opposed to some of the other processes and programs in place that could take years, right, before. And I think the example you used in York Region, I mean, 24 to 36 months and being able to get it done in a year and a half, that really shows you just how quickly you can get things done when you actually have the program to do it. And so I think that was those kind of programs like the Housing Accelerator Fund, for instance, as another example, those are things that are going to be good news for municipalities in particular, where they hold a lot of the keys to unlocking housing development. That is all good. The fact that this government decided to say we're going to double housing starts, we want to really push this. Listen, that's good aspirationally. It's a much tougher job to put into practice. But all of that is, I think, good news on a broad scope. The thing that I was looking for, and I saw it a little bit, but I wasn't really, I thought would be a disappointment to people in the sector, was on urban indigenous housing. I mean, this has been a long-standing issue about how do you address, how do you provide housing that accommodates their needs, but also is culturally appropriate for urban, rural, and northern indigenous who are not subject to one of the three distinction-based strategies that we already have. The fact those strategies were topped up with some more money, I mean, that's good news, because those are some of the most acute housing situations in the country and definitely need to be addressed. But I think 300 million or so for to work on a plan for urban indigenous, when it's something that you promised in 2019, it's something that has been discussed behind the scenes for a couple of years and maybe is a little closer to fruition than it had been, just two or 3 years ago. I mean, that's the kind of thing that I think will be a bit of a disappointment that there wasn't something a little more on that. But it means that maybe potentially in the next budget cycle, you could see that plan laid out and saying, okay, now we're going to start rolling out the money and finding the space in the fiscal framework to actually put the money behind this. And as they say, fill in the final piece of the national housing strategy.
Oh, for sure. I mean, that's a disappointment. I heard that loud and clear. And that's what I think some of the groups around this, the National Housing Council, has said, we want, if you're going to do this right, we want $6 billion, and to get $300 million they're saying is not really going to scratch the surface. But what I've heard also is there's a lot of this in the budget. It's a start. And we're moving forward. We're not moving back. People have said, though, I heard last week too, they're saying in this budget, hey, this is the last big spending budget for a while. Get ready, the next couple of years are going to be very, very tough. So we'll see. We'll see. I mean, it's been a little unpredictable. You never know what can happen. But yeah, I think a lot of good things coming out of it and some disappointments as well. So let's switch gears a little bit from government and talk a little bit about housing and homelessness. In your time, and you touched on some of these, in your time reporting on this, there have been some huge advances, right? I think starting with the 217 national strategy on homelessness. What do you think are some of the biggest advances that you've reported on to end homelessness? And what are some of the areas you think that still need a lot of work?
So I'd say that actually one of the ones that doesn't get a lot of attention, and I remember writing about this when Jean-Yves Duclos was the social development minister, is about data and the point in time counts that are now nationally organized. And obviously there's the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness. They have their own point in time count as well that supplements some of this data. But having now a nationally coordinated point in time count every couple of years, I think has really now helped the federal government get a better sense of what exactly is going on. Getting more data from shelters and trying to figure out, okay, what is going on, for instance, with not just Indigenous shelter users, but veterans, and trying to understand the different communities and the different groups that make up that cohort of people who are considered homeless. That I think has been a huge advantage and a huge step forward for governments and for planning. When you're trying to make evidence-based decisions, you need the evidence. And so having all of that and seeing Statistics Canada rethink some of how it's doing, data collection and what projects it's putting out, all of that I think really now feeds into an ecosystem where policy making can be done at a much broader level, or a much more, maybe not broader, sorry, but much more detailed level. The thing, though, I think that is still something that this government has to work on is on actual construction, right? I mean, the federal government doesn't necessarily build houses, right? It doesn't build buildings. It provides the funding. It provides the financial means to do so. It doesn't necessarily it doesn't pay for infrastructure investments, necessarily when it comes to some of these developments. So if you're talking about a development in Iqaluit, as this government has talked about, well, you need the water system, for instance, to be expanded so that it can handle more homes being attached to it, more buildings. I mean, these are the kind of things that need to have more of an intersectional approach from a funding perspective from this government. And, then as well, when you're talking about, we mentioned this a second ago, that it's municipalities that really control a lot of the zoning and land use planning. And so the federal government doesn't have really a lot of say in that. They can push, they can incentivize, but it's up to the municipalities to make those decisions. So really, I think that what you've seen over time, and what I think this government is still trying to, and not just this government, but governments that will follow it, is trying to figure out how do you turn those aspirational ideas into concrete actions when there are various levels of government involved, and everybody has the same goal, but not necessarily everybody is on the same page about what they want to do. Those are the kind of things I think are still hurdles for this government, even though, like I said, now they have the data at least to come up with some really detailed plans and provide us with one of the most detailed pictures yet about how we are doing as a country when it comes to not only homelessness but affordable housing as well.
Yeah, data absolutely matters, and I'll give you a quick example of that. We were talking about with the point-in-time counts. The Region of York is looking at building a new men's emergency and transitional housing site, and for them, they said that looking at that point-in-time count, 17% of people who were in that count identified as Indigenous. So 17% of that men's emergency shelter of men so they're going to dedicate and make sure at least 70% of the beds will be. So it matters, right? To good decision making as well. And it's interesting what you say. I mean, I think sometimes sound bites and kind of those bumper sticker things around, hey, we're going to add X number of homes. You're right. That's not fully within your control. That flows through the province, and then the province has to work with, in York Region alone, right? 9 municipalities, all with different, councils and zoning and so in different flavors, right? So it's not that simple. You're right. Here's the funding. Does that funding make it all the way through? What people do with that funding? Is the infrastructure in place? So it's a lot more complicated. And I remember when we had Adam Vaughn on the predecessor podcast that was Out of the Blue, he said, you don't realize that it really does take all levels of government working together. And that's not always the easiest thing for that to happen. So yes, very true. All right, so let's talk about there recently NDP Liberals came together. We're going to have government at least, I think, until 2025. What does that coming together? What does that mean for housing and homelessness across Canada?
Well, I think that the simple answer is there's going to be a lot more focus on that, because the New Democrats in the election promised quite a bit on housing, and and not necessarily housing towards home ownership, but affordable housing units, because there is a problem in there. But I mean, for instance, in this budget, the NDP were able to get out of the Liberals some money through the Canada Housing Benefit, right, as to make sure that people who've been affected by higher rents are able to offset some of those costs and offset some of the higher costs that we're all facing. All of that together says something about what the NDP are likely to see, what we are likely to see more of over the course of this agreement. And so I think that you're going to see a larger focus on how are you going to provide those, not just build more units, but maybe how do we provide direct subsidies for those low-income families who need some help, be it on the housing benefit, be it on dental care, potentially pharmacare sometime in the future. How are we going to start making it so that we maybe work on the margins to actually lift them out of core housing need, so that suddenly, instead of them spending 30%, they have maybe additional income actually sitting around to be able to manage their housing costs, because they're now not just dealing with dental, pharmaceuticals, that we're actually helping them on that and be able to lift more people out of core housing need, which is, I mean, that's CMHC's goal for 2030. Make sure everybody in the country has a home that meets their needs and is affordable to them. That's a big aspirational goal. And I remember talking with Evan Siddall about this when he was the head of the CMHC, and he said, listen, we don't have all the answers about how we're going to get there right now, but if we don't set that, we're never going to get there. And so I think that we may actually get closer to that goal over the next couple of years as the New Democrats and Liberals work together, and particularly as the NDP are most likely going to start saying, no, we don't want you to spend on this. We need you to spend here. We need to see this in your budget for us to support it. And so I think you're going to see a little more movement on that between now and 2025.
Movement that is very, very much needed. There's a report the Globe and Mail's had a couple of weeks ago where it said, if you're going to spend 30%, your threshold on housing, what you're supposed to spend on housing, you need to have an household income of $90,000, right? For a one-bedroom apartment in the GTA, $70,000 in most parts of Canada, and $90,000 in the cities. And from where I'm sitting, where people working with Ontario Works or supports or have $8,000 or disability $13,000, a massive gap that needs to be filled, those RGI type of units, etc. So let's hope they push a little harder. I believe too that the supports that rolled down, that was one of the disappointments too. I think it was $500 a year, which would roll out to just over $40 a month for people. That gap in rent is in the hundreds of dollars. So it's really it's a way. It's forward. It's something. But I think that's what we're hearing. What we heard a lot, and we'll continue to hear, is we're not there yet. Right. Now, you mentioned 2030. No,
and I would agree with you. Yeah.
Sorry, we mentioned 2030. We want to end homelessness, right? The government has set a goal of ending homelessness. Are we on track, covering this for this long? Do you believe, is it just, hey, let's set a benchmark and hope we, progress? Or do you believe that really can happen?
it's easy to get cynical about these things, and particularly as a journalist covering it, it's easy to say, "Oh, this is just this is just bluster from politicians who are all trying to show that they can do something," and then they don't really do it. But one of the things that I've tried to do through my career is really be positive in my outlook on things and say maybe it is possible, maybe we can actually do this, and it's just a question of, it's just a question of what do we still need to get there. I actually think it's possible. In a country like this that has done so many different things for so many people, and I love that my dog now wants to get out of the room. So if you give me just 1 second before he keeps barking.
Yeah.
Okay, hey, go. Working from home, it's always a delight. But by the way, my dog, for anybody wondering, is named Cronkite. So we call him the real news hound around here. But I have to have a positive outlook on things, because otherwise you can just get bogged down in being cynical. So I actually think it is possible. I think that it's possible that as we, when you look at, for instance, child poverty rates, they were stubborn for a long time. They were on their way down, but then you saw, what happened with child benefits, and suddenly those poverty rates have plummeted. That's positive news, right? Like I have to give the government some credit for that. And in some of my stories, I was critical about some of their figures when they first came in, when the Liberals first came in, and how are they actually going to do this, and how are they calculating the impacts? And when I saw the numbers, I had to write the story that, well, they did it. And so I think that when you see things like that, when you can see people finding a home, when you can see, for instance, benefits going to renters who need it, so they can get out of an RGI unit and then maybe be able to go into the private market and open that unit up for someone else. When you see a government that's now actually going to provide some rental benefits to veterans, which has been a really successful program in the United States, for instance, I mean, you kind of look at it and say, okay, well, we're making progress. It may not be as fast as, we're not moving like Usain Bolt here. It may be a little slower, like me running the 100 meters, but it is still something that we're making some progress on, and so for that reason, I do have a positive outlook that maybe by 2030 we will get there. And even if we don't, even if we fall short, it's as I tell my daughters, it's better to set the bar high and fall short than set the bar really low and be able to step over it.
Yeah. Well said. And you know what? I think if we learned anything during the pandemic, too, with political will and the resources, this sector can move quick, right? We saw hotels open, new sites open. As I said, within 18 months, 18 units moving. So we can move fast. It can be done. For people who are cynical, this can be done. This is a very solvable issue. It takes political will. It takes communities. It takes a lot of money, but it's very solvable. Well, listen, it's been great chatting with you. Oh, go ahead. Weigh in.
No, I was just going to say, I think, I probably should quote, Tim Richter here, right? Because, because Tim always says this, right? Like, homelessness was not some, we got into this situation because of policy decisions, and we can get out of this through policy decisions. And, that's the message he's always said to me, that everyone has said to me, is like, this is a solvable issue. It's just, and so I think so that's why, that's why I'm always happy to talk to people about policy and to ask government people about, walk me through this policy, because inevitably, they say how they're moving and how they're trying to address something, and they will rightfully say, we know there are other issues and we're going to try to deal with them, but we can only handle so many. There's only so many things you could do at once, and I think that they try to do that in a pretty thoughtful manner. There are people in government who really do great work and really think deeply about these things, and it's not just a file for them to push. It is, how do we really help people, and so I think, having spoken with them, some of them on the record, some of them off the record, that's what I think kind of underlines some of my positivity, that, like Jim said, policy has gotten us here, but policy can get us out of it as well.
Yeah, and usually that people bring out the graphs and show from the 90s how homelessness with the results of bad policy. You're absolutely right. I want to thank you for all you do for this sector, reporting on it, bringing us the news, telling us those stories. It certainly helps us. We take those stories and we relate them out and we make change happen. So it's appreciated. Thank you for all you do. Thanks for being here today. Looking forward to chatting with you more in the future.
Yeah, well, listen, Michael, thank you so much, and thanks to everyone. It's been it is always it has been and continues to be a pleasure to talk to you, to talk to everybody else in the sector, just to hear those stories, and and I have to say, I can't write any stories, and journalists cannot write stories unless people speak with them, and so really it is a testament to the change that you guys make, but also a testament to your willingness to speak to reporters that I think helps in that change. So I don't think I need any thanks as a reporter. I think everybody who has spoken with me really deserves all that.
Well said. Thanks for joining us today. Well, look at that. Another great guest, another great podcast. Listen, I love speaking with journalists who cover the housing and homelessness sector. The stories they hear, the people they talk with, the insight that they have, I always find extremely fascinating. Another great guest on the way home. We want to thank you for joining us for today's podcast. Share it widely and stay tuned next week for another episode that will drop of On the Way Home. We'll see you then.